Hello, I'm Dr. Larissa Tracy, and welcome to Medieval Mischief and Mayhem. I am your host for this podcast, and for this episode, it's just me. That's all right. We will have plenty of other episodes with lots of wonderful guests. I have all kinds of fascinating people that I hope to talk to and have episodes on everything from Vikings and medicine and race in the Middle Ages, all kinds of other interesting things to talk about soon. But for this episode, because it is now, technically speaking, the beginning of spring, still kind of late winter, but beginning of spring, I wanted to follow on from my episode on the Yuletide traditions, all the syncretistic Yuletide traditions that get us from the end of the Celtic New Year with Samhain. And like I said, Celtic, it's more a cultural and linguistic designation than anything, but it is used rather widely. So perhaps more the Irish traditional non-Christian New Year of Samhain, the feast day of the God of the Dead in November. The Yuletide episode covered from that period at the end of October, the beginning of November, through December, and the winter solstice. And you might be thinking, well, it's February almost. It'll be February tomorrow. But of course, February, we still think of as late winter. But in a lot of respects, when we think about that agricultural wheel of the year that I talked about in the Yuletide tradition, when we talk about the way that the seasons start and how long those seasons actually are and what they signify, according to that agrarian calendar and that wheel of the year, February 1st, so tomorrow, is Imbolc. Now, Imbolc marks the beginning of spring. And as I've said before, you might be thinking, no, snow, feet and feet of snow. At least if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, it's still fucking winter. That's fair. That's 100% fair. Because even though it is technically the beginning of spring, we are technically on the threshold of spring, it still feels an awful lot like winter. I did try to kind of say, let's have a little bit of spring. I've got my bees. I figured I'd try to channel a little bit of the oncoming spring weather in theory. But of course, up here, we can get snow well into March and sometimes into April. Who knows? It's Maryland. Apparently, the weather is like 6 different seasons in one day. So all bets are off. But I wanted to talk about the way that the holidays continue almost without pause. And a lot of the things that we associate with February obviously have Christian significance, but they have significance in non-Christian traditions. And some of the ones in February are actually attested to in textual sources. So I've discussed before the fact that a lot of celebrations and a lot of things that happen on a local level often exist in folklore more than they do in literary sources. And folklore is a process of oral tradition and cultural tradition. People get an idea in their head, or they take a story and they build it into a festival, or they build it into a celebration. And then it's passed down far more through word of mouth and through actual celebration and action than it is through literary texts. Now, medieval literature still includes references to some of these non-Christian traditions. And of course, there are all kinds of medieval texts that touch on the pre-existing holidays and essentially explain how they get incorporated into the Christian calendar. So I wanted to go from our winter holidays, the midwinter holiday, of course, the winter solstice, and I talked about that at length in that episode on the Yuletide, and bring us where we are now at the beginning of spring and give us something to look forward to. Because honestly, at this moment in time, I imagine that we could all use something to look forward to. So, to start us off on that thread, essentially, when we talked about the winter solstice and the fact that that's the shortest day of the year, the longest night, and all of the festivals that lead up to it, all of the ways that the midwinter idea, the darkest coldest period, gives rise to all kinds of different traditions, some that are celebration, some that are a way of finding light in that dark period, but also some that are very spooky, very creepy. There are a lot of quote unquote monsters about at that time of year, and we did talk about some of that. But what a lot of people don't understand, and there's some really good books on this if you want to read some of the more popular folkloric traditions. I've mentioned this before. Sarah Clegg's book is very good, The Dead of Winter. She kind of talks about this from anecdotal perspective, but also gives some literary sources and some historical sources. But one of the things that she brings up, and it is an important point to keep in mind, is that this revelry, this celebration goes from Yuletide well until we get to Lent. Now, in the last episode, I did talk about the fact that really what Christian authors were concerned with was the date of Easter, because it was absolutely necessary to calculate the date of Easter because it's based on the moon. It is the first full moon after the spring equinox. So it's tied to the agrarian calendar, but it is also tied to the phases of the moon. Well, that's why it moves. And there was some desire in the Middle Ages, late antiquity, to separate out the celebration of Easter from Passover, the Jewish tradition. That is a whole different celebration that is tied to Jewish survival and resistance in the face of persistent persecution. Now, Easter, of course, aligning with the whole Jesus narrative, where it falls in the spring, there's also a tradition that says, if we count the 9 months of actual gestation, that Jesus was conceived at Easter too. So Jesus was conceived at Easter, born in December, though that's questionable, and then lives his 33 years, and when he is crucified, it's at Easter. But of course, Easter itself already had significance. So the Christian story gets slotted into that. So if we're going from the Yuletide tradition, and I mentioned Twelfth Night, and I mentioned the Three Kings and the Feast of the Epiphany, there are a couple other festivals I didn't really go into. Now, one of the ancient Roman festivals, and several of the Roman authors like Tacitus and Pliny, they talk about the various holidays. And in some cases, like Tacitus is talking about them as they are starting to incorporate Christianity into the Roman Empire. So a lot of the Roman chroniclers are either writing about the festivals that they themselves celebrated, or they're writing about festivals that are falling out of favor because they are not Christian. And when the Roman Empire is Christianized in 314, there was a desire to kind of shunt aside those lawless, chaotic, debauched festivals associated with Roman belief and religion. One of the ones for December, and I didn't really go into it, is Saturnalia. Now, Saturnalia, you could almost argue that it is just the original Mardi Gras, which we will also talk about. But Saturnalia was this opportunity to turn everything on its head. It is a festival in honor of Saturn, the god Saturn. In some various sources, he is more a titan than an actual god of the Roman pantheon. And he is Kronos in the Greek tradition. He is Zeus's father. So there is this whole continuity of Greek and Roman tradition, and all of these festivals take their own form as they are celebrated through the Roman Empire. Now, Saturnalia was drink and food and debauchery and all kinds of things, but it was also a time where kings didn't function as kings. For those few days, December 17th to about December 23rd, you might have fools elevated to a higher position. Slaves, enslaved people who were given a chance to be free for a few days. People would change clothes. They would cross-dress. Now, I will have an entire episode at some point that talks about the cross-dressing tradition. It's a book project that I'm working on, and I've worked on aspects of it. And we have certainly talked about cross-dressing and trans identity in medieval sources, but it goes way back. There has always been this kind of culture of cross-dressing in a lot of different societies, particularly when you want to flip the script, when you want to change the narrative and invert who's on top and who's on the bottom, who is the authority for the day and who isn't. Now, in this period of festivity for Saturnalia that is associated with the winter solstice, very often what you'd have is cross-dressing, women dressing as men dressing as women, and then you'd have people cross-dressing for status. You'd have slaves adorned in clothes that they could not normally wear, and vice versa. So it's not just drink, it's not just revelry, it's offerings to Saturn, it's offerings to the other gods, but it is this whole inversion of the social structure. Now, I said December 17th to December 23rd, but it really takes off and in some cases keeps going. Now, as I said, when the Roman Empire adopts Christianity, the Christian authorities were not so keen on keeping those big festivals of debauchery. Now, I have said in many podcast episodes before that the Catholic Church said a lot of things. Catholic Church tried to stop a lot of people from doing a lot of things. And the reason that Catholic authorities had to keep saying it was because there's a certain amount of sense that people just ignored them and did the fuck whatever they wanted. I mean, when Dr. Leone and I talked about Dante, that's kind of the whole point. The Catholic Church keeps going, stop doing that. Stop doing that. No, really, stop doing that. We keep telling you, stop doing that. And people are like, yeah, no, fuck off. So some of the written texts that we have that are really negative about these various festivals are written from the perspective of people who really wanted them to stop. Now, they could be nuisances. It's not that it was all the Catholic Church going, no, 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 no. And all the revelers really being, yay, we're fine, we're harmless, we're grand, let us be. No, some of these actual festivals did end in violence. Some of them ended in murder. As these traditions continued, not just from late antiquity, but into the early Middle Ages, and actually well into the early modern period, and even in some cases today, through the 19th century, sometimes these festivals could get way too raucous. They'd be chaotic, there'd be violence, and there's every once in a while a murder. There are certainly records of bodies fished out of a river after one of these festivals. And there is, in some cases, a very sad history of violence occurring against people in the revelry, but also in something that is supposed to be in the spirit of fun. So Saturnalia, as this celebration of the god Saturn and this topsy-turvy idea of debauchery and free license at the shortest time of the year, the darkest time of the year, all of that starts to bleed over as we get towards early spring. Now, when we get to Twelfth Night, some of that revelry continues. And I mentioned in the Yuletide episode the fact that Twelfth Night depends on when you count. If you count from Christmas Day, then Twelfth Night is the eve of Epiphany. If you count from St. Stephen's Day, which is December 26th, then Twelfth Night is the Feast of the Epiphany, which is January 6th. And in a lot of respects, the festival season continues to kick off with the Feast of the Epiphany. In fact, Shakespeare's play, Twelfth Night, the whole reason that he wrote Twelfth Night is to celebrate that idea of inversion and messing with the social status. If you're not familiar with Shakespeare's play Twelfth Night, you should read it or see a version of it. It's an extraordinary play. A young woman named Viola is shipwrecked on a foreign shore, and she is concerned as a young noblewoman that people will take advantage of her if they know she's a woman. So Viola dresses as a boy, and as a boy, a young man, goes to the service of a duke, offers herself or himself in the duke's service. And the duke is like, oh, all right, I like the look of this lad. Sure, we'll take him on. Well, then the woman Olivia, who's in love with the duke, then meets the young Cesario and is like, oh, I kind of like this young man. And you get all of this twists and turns, all of these different plots, all of these different machinations. And the Duke finds himself oddly drawn to the young man. And Olivia is definitely drawn to the young man. But of course, the young man is not a young man, it's a young woman dressed as a young man. And in fact, Viola has a brother, and her twin brother, of course, enters the scene. And then you've got all of this confusion. Add to it another man who's in love with her twin brother. And it is an absolute hilarious kind of festival and extravaganza of mistaken identity and who's which gender and who's going to end up with whom. And as I've said before, though, Shakespeare, as extraordinary as he is, and I love Shakespeare. I was a fellow at the Folger Shakespeare Library when I was in high school, believe it or not. I went to high school, graduated high school in Fairfax, Virginia, and I was a high school fellow. And we studied Shakespeare in such depth. It was an amazing opportunity, and I have never forgotten it. I love Shakespeare. I publish on Shakespeare. I write on Shakespeare. Shakespeare never really crosses boundaries. He pushes them. He stabs at them. He tests boundaries, but he never actually crosses them. And it's important with Twelfth Night because at the end of the play, it's a comedy. And if you're going to have a Shakespearean comedy, it has to end in marriage. The more marriages, the better. That's how Shakespearean comedies are supposed to work out. But for Shakespearean comedies, the right people are married to the right people. And when I say the right people, I mean in the context of the 16th century, the context of the Elizabethan court in England or the Jacobean court, the context of class, status, and gender. Even though there is a lot of homoerotic potential in Twelfth Night, it is never realized. And even though there is, for a little bit, the possibility of a same-sex romantic relationship, it does not manifest. And men marry women, and the right class marries the right class, and everybody is joined to the people they are supposed to be joined with socially. So as much as I love Shakespeare, he never really is willing to cross that boundary and really just say, you know what? I think that Antonio and Sebastian should end up together. Totally should. No, doesn't happen. So Twelfth Night as a play is essentially an early modern culmination of so many of those festivals that continued from antiquity through the Middle Ages and even into the early modern period and the Elizabethan court. Now, I've mentioned this before because, of course, A Midsummer Night's Dream by Shakespeare is essentially the same idea because it's the eve of midsummer, which is itself one of those major solstice holidays. And so Shakespeare was very attuned to the continuation of this wheel of the year. Shakespeare used it. He incorporated aspects from both Greek and Roman tradition that came down to him in a variety of forms. Again, I love Shakespeare. He didn't have an original thought in his head when it came to plots. He really didn't. I mean, in all fairness, his gift was language and characters, not plots. He would borrow his plots from other people. Please do forgive the mad kittens. They have decided that it is zoomy period of the day. So if you hear a lot of elephants running around, it's just the cats. Hella particularly is being a bit of a demon. Anyway, so Shakespeare's plays incorporate a lot of earlier material. And that earlier material comes from chronicles, from literature. Chaucer. Shakespeare uses a lot of Chaucer. He's a huge fan of nicking things from Chaucer. But he also incorporates folk tradition, celebrations, and all kinds of things that he would have seen himself. So Twelfth Night is a product of a continuing tradition of syncretistic holidays. So from Twelfth Night, which the Feast of the Epiphany, or the Eve of the Epiphany, from Twelfth Night to Lent is when you get the carnival season. Now, Carnival in Venice, most people think of Venice. And of course, I have never I have never had that opportunity, which is sad. One of these days, I would love to go to Venice. But the whole Carnival di Venezia, so the Carnival, the big famous one in Venice, actually goes from St. Stephen's Day until Shrove Tuesday. Now, the day before Lent is called Shrove Tuesday. That is when everybody kind of gets all of their madness and mayhem, all their mischief and mayhem out of their system before Lent. Shrove Tuesday is the day before Lent. So the Carnival in Venezia is going on right now. And the records indicate that the first festival was held in Venice in 1162, so the 12th century, to celebrate the Venetian Republic's victory over Patriarch of Aquila, Ulrica di Treven, who supported Frederick I, the Holy Roman Emperor. And remember when Dr. Leone and I talked about Dante, we talked about the fact that in the Middle Ages, Italy is not one unified nation. It's individual city-states. And Venice is one of the most powerful city-states on the Italian peninsula. It's actually kind of up over by Croatia. Well, sort of. It's right there at that curve. You'll have to look at a map of Italy. I have unfortunately not spent nearly enough time in Italy as I would like. I've been to Venice for about 5 minutes on my way to a conference in Trieste when I was a grad student. And Trieste is on the border with Croatia. It's 3 miles from the Croatian border. So if you think about the whole geography of Italy, Venice is on the water. It's kind of halfway in that curve of geography, but it was really powerful and really important throughout the Middle Ages, partly because of its situation on the water. So in all of the various contests between Pope and Holy Roman Emperor, Venice is really very important, and their doge, their leaders, their patriarchs controlled immense power. So the whole carnival supposedly began in 1162 to celebrate that victory. However, it got out of hand. And over the years, even though there are not as many references to it, though there are some, it was outlawed entirely by the Holy Roman Emperor in 1797. Now, the whole point of Venice, and if you've ever seen any of the costumes, and the more elaborate costumes, of course, are part of the point of Carnival, it is also part of the point to be masked. Because if nothing else, Carnival, that period of time from St. Stephen's Day to Shrove Tuesday, is really a re-rendering or recreation of Saturnalia, the Lords of Misrule. And if you are in costume and if you are masked, you could be anybody. And an awful lot of the masks that you see in Venice are kind of expressionless. They're meant to be really rather, shall we say, indeterminate, non-gendered, not specific. They may be decorated, but they might be inanimate objects. For the 5 minutes I was in Venice in 1997, I did buy a carnival mask that's a quarter moon. And if you're wearing these masks, you don't know who's male, you don't know who's female, and it really doesn't matter. And in fact, in the Middle Ages, very famously, some of the nobles would dress in such a way that they could kind of go back and forth between their classes and have an awful lot of, shall we say, anonymous liaisons. Because what happened at Carnival stayed at Carnival. Now, as I said, it was outlawed in the 18th century because it could get violent. It could get really kind of dicey at times. And people might get mugged. They might get battered. Somebody, people did actually get killed. It happened. And, people might get drunk and fall in a canal. That certainly happened too. But in some ways, because it focused on the inversion of social classes and also the inversion of gender status and the whole political inversions, it became a threat, and the Holy Roman Emperor banned it. Now, it starts again in Venice the modern iteration of Carnival in 1979. And because it is often now associated specifically with the lead up to Lent, Catholic countries often will celebrate their variation of Carnival. But remember, the original one in Venice was not specifically religious oriented. I mean, it happened from St. Stephen's Day until Shrove Tuesday, but it was not in and of itself tied to religion per se. Carnaval de Rio de Janeiro is a little more focused on the lead up to Lent. Now, it's a much shorter period. If you're going to go to Carnival in Brazil, which would be extraordinary, again, something else I would dearly, dearly love to do, but that is a colonial import from the Catholic authorities because Brazil is Portuguese originally. It was a colony of Portugal that was taken and conquered. The Portuguese conquered the indigenous people, and the whole administration, very, very Catholic, worked in local indigenous traditions into their own celebration of that period before Lent. Now, in Rio de Janeiro, as I said, it goes from the Friday before Ash Wednesday until Shrove Tuesday. So it's really only a very long weekend for Carnival in Rio. And the first festival was held in 1723. But, you know, it actually started with the first colonial imports into Brazil in the 1650s because the Portuguese decided to revive some of the festivals associated with Bacchus. Now, Bacchus is the Greek god of wine. And a lot of people might go, oh, well, a bacchanal, that makes complete sense. Now, if you're familiar with Ovid, or if you're familiar with some of the other stories that record the Bacchanal in Greek tradition, those got really violent. But the Bacchanal in the Greek tradition, it was an unfettered celebration of the god of wine, Bacchus, which of course the Roman version is Dionysus. But the Bacchanal were women who were in such a frenzy, usually women, sometimes men were involved, but largely women, who were in such a frenzy of ecstasy and drink, they were almost overcome, that they were said to occasionally dismember men with their bare hands. There's a very famous story of Orpheus, who was supposedly torn apart by a bacchanal. He was an extraordinary musician. He was a harper, and he was apparently ripped to pieces by a mad crowd of drunken women. Oh well. But the Bacchus tradition does kind of take hold with the Portuguese colonialists, the colonists in the 17th century. They kind of import that. And it's entirely likely that some of that is just from the various European traditions of these kind of carnival celebrations, possibly from Venice. It's impossible to trace it all the way back to Venice. But these festivals are still tied to that festival and idea of the Lords of Misrule, turning things on their head. Now, the first Rio Masquerade took place in 1850. So while they had the festivals themselves were not necessarily masked as in Venice, but their costumes now really, really incorporate the indigenous traditions for the Brazilian people and work it into the Portuguese traditions as well. So that's where you actually get the samba school. The samba school is a specific musical dance movement that is indigenous to Brazil, and it's a really amazing beat. But the samba school has these parades, and they have contests as part of the festival in Rio, and they incorporate an awful lot of different influences because, of course, samba is Brazilian dance, as I said, the indigenous dance, but it mixes African influences, and the costumes often mix those religious and cultural traditions because, of course, the Portuguese, as most European colonizers did, they brought enslaved Africans to Brazil. So you get a mix of the African traditions with the Catholic traditions, with the indigenous traditions that works into all of these extraordinary festivals and celebrations in modern day Brazil. But that period really is the Friday before Ash Wednesday until Shrove Tuesday. Now, of course, in similar fashion, In the United States, we have Mardi Gras. Now, Mardi Gras means Fat Tuesday. And Mardi Gras in New Orleans goes from Twelfth Night, the Feast of the Epiphany, to Ash Wednesday. So the Fat Tuesday is the day before Ash Wednesday. Fat Tuesday, like Shrove Tuesday, is when you get it all out of your system. But the first Mardi Gras was not in New Orleans. The first celebration of Mardi Gras was actually in Mobile, Alabama. But again, it is a product of French colonialism, Spanish colonialism on the Gulf Coast of what is now Florida, Alabama, and Louisiana. And of course, New Orleans as a city had Spanish influence, French influence. You have enslaved people. You have formerly enslaved people from Haiti, African enslaved people mixing all of their traditions. You have Cajun, you have Creole, mix of languages, mixes of food, music. All of these things work into the modern Mardi Gras tradition. And the Mardi Gras celebrations in New Orleans respect and represent a lot of that history. The Mardi Gras Indians actually represent the African American population and their part in the Mardi Gras celebrations. I have seen pictures for this year's parade. It hasn't happened yet, but I have good friends who live in New Orleans, and they are part of the crew of Muses, and they have gone through and been allowed to take photos in some of the crew barns for things like the Parade of Rex. And Mardi Gras now, so many of these different crews that build these extraordinary floats and have costumes and riders on those floats who throw favors. And there's going to be a bit of a change in the favors that they throw this year because tariffs have made some of the cheaper bead throws very expensive, but also because, honestly, the amount of rubbish that throwing a lot of plastic beads produces when people don't catch them is extraordinary. So New Orleans is trying to take the opportunity where they're being priced out by the ridiculous tariffs that are being imposed by the current administration. They're taking that opportunity to kind of make their throws a bit more eco-friendly and a bit more responsible and sustainable. But the Mardi Gras tradition now works in Greek, Roman, Norse, all kinds of other traditions. You might have floats that represent the goddess Isis. You might have floats that represent the goddess Frigga. Or you might have even one that represents the Irish goddess Bríd. It all depends on the theme for that year and the parade. When I went to Mardi Gras in 2020, and a bunch of us went down, and we did 2 costume changes a day from the Thursday before Mardi Gras until Mardi Gras itself, though I had to leave on Mardi Gras. We did 2 costume changes a day to participate as audience in those parades. It was an extraordinary example of multicultural syncretism because so many different traditions and literary traditions and religious traditions are represented in those Mardi Gras parades. And they are amazing to see. And it is kind of a testament to the resilience and the ingenuity and the creativity of the population of New Orleans to put this on every year. And I went to Mardi Gras when I was in college as an undergrad, not in costume. That was a very different experience when I was 18 years old and 19 years old. I had a camera. It was a 35 millimeter. We didn't have Facebook. It's just as well we didn't have Facebook. That was in the early 90s. But Mardi Gras represents that extraordinary cultural diversity of such a wonderful city. I mean, I love New Orleans. New Orleans is one of my favorite cities in the world. And I love to go to New Orleans off season, not even just for Mardi Gras. But Mardi Gras is what American audiences think about when they think that huge carnival celebration. And it is grounded in Twelfth Night. In fact, now in New Orleans, the first set of parades for Twelfth Night is the Joan of Arc parade, because Joan of Arc, Jeanne d'Arc, who you have been introduced to through several episodes of the podcast, Jeanne d'Arc is actually kind of the patron figure of New Orleans, because of New Orleans' French heritage, but also simply by her virtue as a figure of resistance. And there is an extraordinary Joan of Arc parade for the Feast of the Epiphany, and it's an arts parade where people hand out handcrafted, extraordinarily beautiful throws. They're not really throwing, they're handing them out. That just represents the creativity and the diversity of all the people who march in the Joan of Arc parade. And so Mardi Gras, which, and this year, I should point out, this year, because of the placement of Easter, Mardi Gras is early. Mardi Gras is February 16th. So Mardi Gras is one of these holidays that is coming up. But because these festivals start at the end of the Yuletide celebration season, and they really do, it's like a continuous season. We go from 12th night right into Mardi Gras, 12th night right into Carnival in Venice. It is a continuous celebration that brings us to the weeks after the beginning of spring. So this whole idea of celebration and Lords of Misrule and cross-dressing and drinking and debauchery and getting it all out of your system before Ash Wednesday, Lent, where you have to give things up. Okay, if you want to. You do you. But that whole period of abstinence that goes from Lent until Easter is really bracketed by those periods of celebration and holiday. Now, of course, obviously before Lent, and as I said, Fat Tuesday this year is February 16th, but the first day of spring, that spring festival of fertility rituals and an opportunity to really start to welcome back the spring season, that's February 1st. That is the festival of Imbolc in Irish. And that tradition of Imbolc is actually fairly well attested in medieval Irish literary sources. Now, I've said this before, and a lot of people say, what the hell is spring like about February 1st? That's fair. Pile of snow, it's possible. 100% possible. Sure, we just had Snowmageddon last week, but February 1st is that cross-quarter holiday, that period of time between the solstice and the equinox, and it marks the beginning of the tilling season. This is when you start to prepare your fields for planting. You haven't planted anything yet, but the ground is starting to thaw, depending on where you are, and your temperatures and climate change, which, by the way, is exceptionally real. Fuck off anyone who says it's not. But depending on where you are, you're going to start preparing the process of planting. Your stores are getting a little light. You've been stuck inside, or it's been cold. We're talking Northern Hemisphere here. If you're on the Southern Hemisphere, it's a completely different celebration. But Imbolc recognizes and kind of represents that beginning period of preparing for spring. Now, Imbolc, February 1st, and it is celebrated the night before, though some people do mathematical calculations and calculate it based on the moon and calculate it based on less a calendar and more on the astronomical significance. So it might fall on February 2nd or 3rd. But calendrically speaking, by the calendar, the Feast of Imbolc is February 1st, and you start the night before, so January 31st. Now, Imbolc in the Irish tradition is associated with the goddess Bríd. Now, Bríd is a short variation of Bridget. And you might go, oh, right, Saint Bridget. Well, yes, the patroness of Ireland, the female patron saint of Ireland is Saint Bridget. But hagiographically speaking, and that means her story as a saint's life, we don't have an awful lot of evidence for that. Who knows? It's entirely likely that Saint Bridget is a Christian variation of Bríd. Bríd is the goddess of fertility, of livestock. She is associated with all kinds of things. She's a goddess of pre-Christian Ireland, and she actually appears in the Lever Gavala. I mean, we have versions of her story in the Lever Gavala, in the Cathmaig Turd, and in Cormac's Glossary. So there are at least 3 medieval texts, and the Lever Gavala is from the 12th century, and Cathmaig Turd actually comes from, it's about the 12th, 13th, 14th century. I'd have to check the actual dates on that one. It's slightly later. But Cormac's Glossary was written by Christian scribes in the 9th century. So as early as the 9th century, when Ireland is fully Christianized, for the most part, you have references to this goddess figure, and she is a goddess figure, and she's associated with torches and cows, particularly white cows, serpents, swans, bees, oak trees, dandelions, all kinds of stuff. But she is this fertility goddess that works her way into the Christian canon as the consort, non-sexually, of course, well, maybe early Christianity, all bets are off, of St. Patrick. So St. Bridget is associated with St. Patrick as his consort, as his companion. But more likely, she was the goddess figure that we see in Cormac's Glossary, in the Lever Gavala, and in Cathmaig Turd. Now, it's possible that she's one of those variations of the tripartite goddess. Now, that's the goddess with 3 forms. And I've said this before when it comes to Morgan, or the Morian. The Morian goddess of war also had 3 forms, the maiden, mother, and crone. The goddess Bríd did too. And so she may be associated with that whole passing of age as much as the Morian is. You often see that where the Irish goddess figures have more than 1 form. Now, she's said to have been, according to the Lever Gavala, a member of the Tuatha Dé Danann. And the Tuatha Dé Danann are one of the earlier people that in the whole invasions of Ireland, and I talked about this when I talked about the Lever Gavala in one of my earlier episodes, those are the people that become associated with the Fae, eventually, or the She meaning the dwellers in the hills. And so the Tuatha Dé Danann are an ancient people kind of pushed to the west by the succession of invasions and takings, which is why the Lever Gavala talks about these non-Christian entities, because it's leading up to the settlement of Ireland with the people who would then become the Irish. And part of that process means driving the Tuatha Dé Danann out to the west. And Bríd, the goddess, is the daughter of the Dada and the wife of Bres, with whom she had the son Rudin. And Rudin, of course, is associated with the word red. So she's a pretty well-attested figure in Irish medieval literary sources. And there are all kinds of celebrations to Bríd that still survive. One of them, of course, is the festival of Imbolc. And because, of course, she was the pre-Christian cursor to St. Bridget, Bríd's Day is the same day as St. Bridget's Day. And that's February 1st. So if you're going to celebrate the day of the goddess Bríd, if you're going to pay her homage, then you want to do it with things that are warm and sunny. If you want to leave out clothing the night before Imbolc, the idea is that the goddess Bríd will walk across it, and then that garment will be blessed. You might leave a scarf out, and if the goddess Bríd walks across your scarf, then anytime you wear it, it will have healing capacity. It might heal a sore throat. If you have any kind of other garments that you want to be blessed, leave it out on the night before Imbolc. And perhaps also make some cakes of oat and rosemary and various other lemon. If you can get some lemon at that time, especially in the Middle Ages, you were bloody lucky. It might be dried. You would zest it, and then you'd have this kind of reminder of the possibility of spring and then summer in your celebrations and your food for the festival of Imbolc. Now, of course, the Christian calendar had to go take that. And they did that not only in the celebration of Saint Bridget. So not only do you have the Christianization of the goddess Bríd, as St. Bridget, and her feast day coinciding with the celebration for the goddess. But one of the major festivals of the Catholic Church that involve the goddess, the Virgin Mary, sorry, I almost said goddess, and I've said before, you don't get much more goddess-like than the Mother of God, is Candlemas. Now, Candlemas is February 2nd, and that specifically is dedicated to the Virgin Mary. And instead, the ultimate Christian goddess figure, that's kind of the whole point of this. But that is the day that she was allowed back into the Temple of Jerusalem after giving birth, because women who'd given birth had to be purified before they could go into the temple again, because she was Jewish. And that's the Jewish tradition. Those of you who want to go Christian, no, Mary was a good Jewish woman, just like Jesus was a good Jewish boy. Keep that in mind. But Candlemas represents the presentation of Jesus at the Temple of Jerusalem and the purification of the Virgin Mary after her lying in, after giving birth. And so, of course, that is dated from the Feast of the Nativity. And if we're going to go with December 25th, that brings us in time to February 2nd. So Candlemas, which was dedicated to the Virgin Mary, who's the ultimate Christian goddess figure, her day of purification is the day after that feast day associated with the Irish goddess Bríd. Now, Candlemas represents the return of the light in same way that Imbolc does. The weather on the day determines the early spring or more winter. And of course, that's where we get Groundhog Day. Now, you know what? Bríd was also associated with weather prognostications. In fact, the whole festival of Imbolc, in some ways, St. Bridget's Day, was also associated with, well, what's the weather going to be like? And St. Bridget's Day on February 1st, there's actually a poem that was recorded in 1900 in Irish that talks about Imbolc as a time for weather prognostication. And the poem in English reads, "The serpent will come from the hole on the brown day of Bríd, though there should be 3 feet of snow on the flat surface of the ground." i.e., if a snake leaves his hibernation on February 1st, even if there's snow on the ground, then that means spring is on its way. You see, it is a variation of what becomes Groundhog Day, where, of course, in this country, we look to a rodent to come out, and if he sees his own shadow, 6 more weeks of winter. Now, in this country, Groundhog Day is February 2nd. So we've gotten through Imbolc, and now we're on Candlemas. But as I said, Candlemas, even in the medieval Christian tradition, was part of this, well, are we actually going to get spring? Or is there going to be more fucking snow? Anything's possible. But these traditions have gone on for centuries. And somehow in America, we decided to bestow that prognostication on a very large rodent. I mean, he's adorable, but still. So, Candlemas associated with the Virgin Mary. The day after that feast associated with a 3-figure goddess of fertility, Bríd, who is also then Christianized as Saint Bridget, who is the consort of Saint Patrick. Now, some of the things that you can do for Imbolc and Candlemas, and some people actually work those festivals together. They start on January 31st, the eve of Imbolc, go through Imbolc itself into Candlemas, and they kind of incorporate these different traditions all into one celebration. Beeswax candles are blessed on this feast day as for Candlemas. It's the whole idea of you bless your beeswax candles, and then whenever you use them, they will bestow those blessings on the household. So they're associated with the Candlemas and the purification of the Virgin Mary, but they also go into that Imbolc tradition. Now, I mentioned food. For a lot of these festivals, we have all kinds of varieties of different food, but as I said, Shrove Tuesday in some places, when we get up to Lent, Pancake Day. When I lived in Ireland, I was astonished. It was the first time I was introduced to Shrove Tuesday as Pancake Tuesday. And Pancake Tuesday, the Irish pancakes are a bit more like crepes. And now you can make a Dutch baby pancake, and it's almost like a sweet Yorkshire pudding that is basically eggs, milk, flour, sugar, bit of salt, and you beat it and put really cold batter into a really hot pan with butter, and it should rise gloriously. That's the idea. For some reason, my Dutch babies always rise, but my Yorkshire pudding is kind of hit or miss. Don't know why. But in other traditions, you might have the oat and rosemary bannock cakes, lemon tarts. Lemon curd is a big thing because you can make lemon curd and store it away. And so even if you don't have access to the fresh fruit in the course of a long medieval winter, you might have made some lemon curd and have that, break it out for spring, and have that as part of your celebrations for Candlemas and for Imbolc. But the whole idea, again, with the lead up to Shrove Tuesday is to get it all out of your system and clean out your cupboards, because you don't want to be tempted by anything during Lent. So you're going to have your pancakes and you're going to have your crepes and all of these different things. The day before, you have to basically say, okay, now we will only eat simple fare, maybe fish, lots of porridge, nothing terribly exciting, because that's Lent. So all of that is associated with that period from the beginning of February until we get to Shrove Tuesday, whatever day it happens to fall on. Now, of course, as I said, Mardi Gras this year is February 16th. But we all know what falls on February 14th. Oh my God, Valentine's Day. Now, my main problem with Valentine's Day is largely because, well, it sets up so many romantic expectations. And unless you have somebody who's a willing participant in engaging in that, and I mean symbiotic, not just men doing for women, but women doing for men and women doing for women and men doing for men, unless you've got a partner who's actually invested as you are, it's gonna suck. And if you don't have a partner at all, well, meh, fuck that. It's awful because everybody's all, oh, romance, Valentine's Day. I have rarely had a partner who actually wanted to engage in Valentine's Day. And an awful lot of the men that I've dated have been like, nope, hate Valentine's Day. And you kind of have to poke them, because I am a romantic, not a hopeless romantic. I am an avowed romantic because I believe in romance. But February 14th is a completely constructed holiday. Let's be honest. It is basically a day of commercialized love. And the expectations of Valentine's Day have gotten a little ridiculous altogether. So how did we get there? Well, we started with the Roman holiday of Lupercalia. Kind of. The Roman holiday of Lupercalia is February 15th. Now, if you get modern popular culture versions of Lupercalia, it's crazy. If you Google Lupercalia, and you may not want to do that, you get things like, once they had anointed themselves in blood, they would take to the streets nude, swaying their bloody animal straps around. When they came across a woman, they'd generally slap her with a gory goat hide, and the ladies loved it. That's right. They'd go out of their way to get slapped with a bloody goat's hide because they believed it would make you more fertile in the coming year. Now, that's from a website called Unsettling Things, and they really amped up the aspect of Lupercalia that is naked young men carrying goatskin whips dipped in blood, running from a cave at the top of Rome through the Roman cities, whipping women left, right, and center, supposedly. Actually, they'd tap them, and women would stand in a position to be tapped because they believe it gave them fertility. Now, remember, this is February, and the period of fertility, you know, it's entirely likely that some of these people might have already been pregnant because of long, cold winters with not a lot else to do. But if you wanted to have children and if you wanted to ensure fertility, you would be in a position to be tapped by one of these young men running in the Lupercal and making that run through Rome. And yes, they were naked or they wore loincloths. And yes, they carried goatskin whips dipped in blood. And I do tell my students that please don't do that on campus because A, it is actually cold here, February 14th and 15th. And also I disavow all responsibility or knowledge if you get caught by university authorities running naked through campus, hitting people with bloody whips. Bad idea. Don't do that. No, really, don't do that. But the idea that Valentine's Day comes out of this is a little erroneous. It just happens to be a Roman festival. Now, Lupercalia itself is based probably on the festival of the wolf. That's what it means, Lupercalia. And of course, the mythical founders of Rome were the twins Romulus and Remus. Now, Romulus and Remus were the children of the Vestal Virgin Rhea Silvia and Mars. One of those stories in Roman mythology, much like Greek mythology, where Greek gods won't keep it in their toga. Now, in fairness, Greek and Roman goddesses weren't much better. They certainly shagged an awful lot of mortal men and made their lives miserable. That certainly happens. But you have far more stories of Roman or Greek gods who, and I'm not even going to be nice about this, those are not stories of love. In most of those cases, those gods rape women. They rape nymphs. They rape Vestal virgins. They rape mortal women. Those stories that involve transformation or metamorphosis that are recorded in Ovid's text, the Metamorphoses, which means transformations, is basically an indictment of the entire Roman pantheon of gods, who, in fairness, are absolute shits. They are horrible entities. And in fact, Ovid's text is a satire. He is making fun of that idea. And there is some suggestion in Ovid, partly depending on the translation, but there's some suggestion in Ovid. He was writing at the turn of the 1st century CE that he's more or less questioning the preeminence of the Roman pantheon of gods and thus questioning the inheritance or the lineage of the Roman emperor from those gods, because the Emperor Augustus, who was emperor when Ovid was writing, and Augustus exiles Ovid because he wrote satire, and Augustus got his knickers in a wad and apparently had a very thin skin, and he exiles Ovid for writing stuff about him or about his sister. That's a whole nother issue. But Ovid is being critical of this idea that the emperor is descended from gods. And he's also saying, well, if he is, he's not descended from anything great and divine. And there are references potentially to a monotheistic entity in Ovid, where he's rejecting the pantheon. But for the most part, the stories of those Greek gods that get transposed into the Roman tradition come down through texts like Ovid's. And Ovid does not paint these people in a good light. So when we get the story of the Vestal Virgin Rhea Silva and Mars, it is not a romance. It is a rape. And she gives birth to these twins. And of course, they are abandoned. And they are suckled by a female wolf in a cave at the foot of the Palatine Hill in Rome. Now, that is the Lupercal. The cave is associated with the wolf, so it's called the Lupercal. And the Luperci, the priests of Faunus, celebrated the rituals of Lupercalia in that cave before running through the city. And this festival, where they ran from the Lupercal cave through the city of Rome, persisted until 494 CE. So well into the period of the Christian Roman Empire, because the Roman Empire is Christianized in 314. So in 494, they are still doing the run for Lupercalia. But of course, the festival isn't necessarily tied to Romulus and Remus. Now, it is a fertility festival. That is the whole idea. And it's also associated with Februus. Now we get the months, in most cases, in the American and Anglophone calendars, those names for the months come from Roman gods. I mean, I've mentioned this before. We get our days of the week in English, both from Norse gods and the goddess, because Friday is Friga's Dia, Some people believe it's Freya's dia, but it's not. Freya is not nearly as important as Frigga in the Norse pantheon. And when we do our Viking episode, I will talk about that. But we get some of our days of the week from Norse tradition in English. And then we get Saturday, Saturn, and we get our months from these Roman gods. So February is in honor of Februes, and he's an ancient Italic god of purifications. And of course, there's an even more ancient god, Februa or Februalia, which is the festival of washing and purification that occurs on the 15th, the same time as Lupercalia. And so where we've got the Christian Candlemas, that is the purification of the Virgin Mary, then you get the Roman festival, the pre-Christian Roman festival of Februalia or Februa, which is a purification ritual and fertility ritual that occurs February 15th. Then you kind of get that rite of the Lupercal that was specific to Rome and Lupercalia. These things probably all just came together. And the celebration took a bit of this and a bit of this and a bit of this, and it all gets worked into a massive celebration depending on where you are. But by and large, they are associated in some way with fertility. And of course, Lupercalia is said to celebrate both Lupa, the she-wolf, and Faunus or Pan, who is also called Lupercus. So you have all of these different possible entities in the Roman festivals. They all just kind of smushed together, and you get these different celebrations. Now, we have references to the actual celebrations in the Roman chroniclers, the Roman historians of the time. Appian, in his civil wars, actually talks about Mark Antony, and he talks about Caesar, and then he talks about the celebration of Lupercalia. Also in Plutarch, we get a reference to Lupercalia. So there are these writers, and I've mentioned this before, some of the other writers like Tacitus, as he came in contact or read the records as the Roman Empire spread out, he records the stories of the various non-Roman tribes and their celebrations. In a lot of cases, that's where we get our evidence from these observers who are recording the festivals either as they heard about them or as they saw them themselves. And in some cases, they're being kind of judgmental because they think they should stop. But in some cases, they are actually saying, you know what? This is wonderful. This is fabulous. Look at this interesting thing that these people do. So we do have records of Lupercalia being celebrated, recorded by Appian, and then recorded again by Plutarch. But you might ask yourself, how the hell did we go from that to Valentine's Day? How on earth did we go from Lupercalia running naked through the streets of Rome, fertility rituals, hitting people with goatskin whips? So some people might say we didn't go from it. They might actually still do that on Valentine's Day. As I said, you do you. How did we get to St. Valentine's Day? Where the hell did that come from? As most things, the Catholic Church said, we have this festival. Let's put a saint on it. And that's what they did. Now, there are three St. Valentines, probably, possibly, maybe, kind of all smushed together. There are at least 3 different churches that claim to have the relics of this saint. And I've talked about hagiography before, and the tradition of saints' lives and the tradition of keeping saints' body bit pieces, parts all over, you know, in nice little glass cases where you can go, oh, look, the skull of Saint Valentine. In fact, the Basilica di Santa Maria in Rome claims to have it. In a beautiful glass case, and you can Google this, they have a skull that is adorned with flowers, as you do, that claims to be Saint Valentine's skull. Now, there are remains of other Saint Valentines all over the place. There is a full skeleton of Saint Valentine in Monasilice in Sicily, and he is wearing like full, I would say, kind of priestly vestments. He's got like a robe on, but you know, skull, and they've got gloves on him. Chances are they don't actually have the full skeleton. I mean, they say they do, but all you can see is like this partially stuffed body in the vestments, the priestly vestments, and a skull. So who knows? But that said, there in Specifically, Whitefriars Church in Dublin also claims to have the remains of St. Valentine. And I've been there and I have seen the shrine to St. Valentine. Now, the one in Dublin is not nearly as phenomenally interesting as the skeletal remains on display in Sicily or the skull on display in Rome, because in Whitefriars Church in Dublin, it's a box. It's a very nice box, but it's just a box. And who the fuck knows what's in that box? But according to Whitefriars, it is the relics of St. Valentine. How he got to Dublin, not a clue. I'm sure there's a story. Now, there's also a church in Madrid, the San Anton's Church in Madrid, that purports to have some of St. Valentine's remains as well. That one, if you Google it, skull with femurs, because femurs make amazing relics because they're the longest bone in the human body and they're really sturdy. So you can do all kinds of things with femurs. And in this case, it's almost like a skull and crossbones because it's got the skull and it's got the femurs. That is in St. Anton's Church in Madrid, Spain. And then there's another one, the tomb of St. Valentine in the Basilica di San Valentino in Tierney. Now, this one is a tomb, so it has an effigy that purports to be the body of St. Valentine, but he is, of course, arrayed as a bishop. He's got his crozier, he's got his mitre, he's got his hat, he's got his robes, but it could be a body that looks like he's been kind of spray painted gold, but chances are it is really, really, really just an effigy. And I've said this before, the Catholic Church has a feast day for everything. There are at least 1-2 saints on every day. There's a whole calendar of saints' feast days, and you can have multiple saints on a day. The big ones, though, all fall on the same cross-quarter days as that wheel. And Imbolc, I mean, you might think St. Bridget's not that big of a deal. Well, she is in Ireland. And the month of February, if you look at an Irish language calendar, the month of February is Imbolc, just as much as the month of November is Samhain. So for the Irish, St. Bridget is the consort of Patrick, his companion. And so she is a pretty big deal. And of course, the Christianized version of the ancient Irish goddess Bríd. Okay, then you get Lupercalia, fertility ritual, wolves, maybe, depends, Februis, all of these different traditions melded together. And then the Catholic Church went St. Valentine, and we're going to stick in there a reference to love, maybe. He possibly married people. He might have been in love. It's possible. We don't know. We're making this shit up as we go anyway. And Chaucer says, okay, we're going to associate in the tradition of the medieval cult of love, the tradition of medieval courtly love, but also this medieval idea of lovers who are so lost in their love that they lose themselves, which is not a good idea, by the way. He's going to associate that with Valentine's Day. So Valentine's Day really is a syncretistic holiday. You get your early spring fertility festival dedicated to an Irish goddess who morphs into a Christian saint. You get a Roman festival dedicated to a god or gods of sex and procreation designed to boost fertility. You get an early Roman saint executed for possibly marrying young couples illegally or converting the provost and his daughter to Christianity and then, professing his love for that young woman, or helping Christians escape Roman persecution. You get a medieval romantic tradition celebrating love, successful, unsuccessful, disastrous, based loosely on Roman gods and goddesses. And then you get your medieval dream vision about a contest between falcons for the love of a tercel in a garden of love near the Temple of Venus, where the female gets to choose and decides not to choose either, set on Valentine's Day. Now, all of that, of course, brings us through to February 14th. But you can see how these different traditions evolve. Some of them evolve from religious traditions. Some of them evolve from an inversion of culture and society, the Lords of Misrule. And I mean, work into that still some of the Yuletide monsters in Wales, in Chepstow, Wales. Sometimes the Mari Lwyd, that is our wonderful, wonderful, wonderful horse skull that goes door to door, wassailing and begging in poetry to be let in. Says, of course, you want to let your monsters into your house. Hospitality. The Chepstow Mary Lwyd sometimes takes place as late as January 20th. So a lot of these festivals kind of leak out of the Yuletide period, the solstice period, the Feast of the Epiphany, and continue on into the early days of spring, because it's not a set stop. You don't go, all right, we're done celebrating. Very often you just have continuity. And as is the case for most holidays, most celebrations that have earlier sources and earlier iterations, they're really tied to this constant sense of celebration, the need to celebrate, the desire to promote fertility, especially as you're going to plow your fields and start planting your fields as we get closer into March. All of these things associated with both the birth of Christ, the death of Christ, and as I said, in the medieval tradition, some philosophers like to tie things theologically to the inception of Christ, that he is conceived at Easter as well. A nice little wrap up there in terms of chronology and time. Very sorry, Hella. I apologize for that. We did try to get her up here with the least amount of disruption possible. So you get all of these holidays that constantly work into the same themes. The agricultural calendar, where we've had the shortest day, we've had a period of cold and snow and freezing weather. Your stores are getting low, but now you've got to prepare for the spring. You're going to plow your fields. You're going to clean out your larders. And in the Christian tradition, you're going to get everything out of your system before that period of abstinence for Lent. Because, of course, Lent is then the 40 days to Easter. And, of course, the 40 days to Easter will take us to the spring equinox, because Easter is the first full moon after the equinox. So all of these things are tied together. And as a consequence, whether the traditions were Christian, pre-Christian, whether they are polytheistic, whether they are pagan in our modern sense of paganism, all of these traditions are essentially a way to give people hope. They're a way to give people light and hope after long darkness. And the celebration of food and drink and wine and song, all of these things are meant to remind people what we live for. Sure, life can carry on. Life should be sustained. Life needs food, it needs fields, it needs crops, it needs all of those things. But life has to be worth living. And it is not enough to simply live. It has to be worth living. So all of these festivals, all of these celebrations entwine that idea of the need to live, the necessities of life, with the joy of life. And of course, we are coming upon that holiday season now. And tonight, on January 31st, is the eve of Imbolc. So I would like to wish all of you a blessed Imbolc. And either if you wish to honor the goddess Bríd, or if you'd like to honor the Saint Bridget, so the goddess Bríd or the Saint Bridget, or if you'd like to leave out your garments for her, do so tonight. But eat your bright, sunny, yellow, lemony cakes tomorrow, your Dutch baby pancakes, just to celebrate the possibility of the returning of the light. So I wish you all a blessed Imbolc. And of course, we're coming up to Valentine's Day. And if you do not have anyone special to celebrate with, or if the person special in your life is a bit of a drag and doesn't like to celebrate Valentine's Day, that's okay. You could always offer Lupercalia instead. Maybe the goatskin whip would be more appealing. But even if you don't want to participate in that commercial holiday, Mardi Gras is February 16th. So as we come up to Mardi Gras and we come up to that period before Lent, I say, laissez les bon temps rouler, let the good times roll, and I will see you in the next episode of Medieval Mischief and Mayhem. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm Dr. Larissa Tracy, and this is Medieval Mischief and Mayhem.